All right, I'm back. All right, we are gonna get the show started here. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Again, I am Crystal Corbray for anyone who joined after my very brief introduction a minute ago. I'm the programming and marketing librarian for Yakima Valley Libraries. Tonight is the fourth and final event in our Authors Out Loud series. Normally, we would be meeting each other in person and having a nice chat, and you'd get to chat with the authors, but it's a strange new world. So, thank you all for joining us virtually. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We are going to be recording tonight's session. So, if you prefer that your face not appear in the recording, just go ahead and keep your video off. We ask that you keep your microphones muted for the duration of the presentation. And run of show, after I finish this little piece, I'm going to do a quick introduction for Ellen, and then she's going to take it away with a presentation. And at the end of the event, there'll be time to do a Q&A with Ellen. We'll set this up so that if you've got questions at the end, you can type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll read those aloud. Or if you're brave, I believe Ellen was okay with just having folks unmute themselves and ask questions, so we can do that either way. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, I'm going to do her introduction. So Ellen Allmendinger grew up in Yakima County and later moved to Portland before returning to Yakima to work for the county's Public Services and Engineering Department. With her return to Yakima, she developed an interest in the area's old buildings and later embarked on a new hobby of researching the history of Yakima. In 2016, after years of research, she started leading historical walking tours in downtown Yakima and later added historical tours of Tahoma Cemetery in partnership with the city of Yakima. Her first book, Hidden History of Yakima, was published in 2018, at which time she was still offering tours, giving historical presentations, and researching for her second book, Murder and Mayhem in Central Washington, which was released in February of 2021. Ellen retired earlier this year and is currently working on her third book while also preparing for summer tours at Tahoma Cemetery. She lives in Yakima County with her son and 2 dogs, and we are very pleased to have her tonight. So Ellen, all you.
Thanks, I appreciate it. Hey, I'm surprised there's as many people here tonight. That means there's history lovers. That's always good. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation. Crystal did a great job with the introduction for background, so I really don't need to get into the specific personal stuff. But let me go ahead and get started with my PowerPoint presentation, see if I can get this started for you. Just give me a minute. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Crystal, can you see that? Perfect. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about the story behind, inside, and between my books. My first book was Hidden History of Yakima, released in 2018. And my second one was Murder and Mayhem in Central Washington, which was released in February of this year. This all started, as Crystal said, when I began researching downtown Yakima buildings and various local histories. I researched it so much that I was driving my friends nuts, and they told me to go tell somebody else. So I was trying to figure out how to do that. After years of researching some of Yakima's historic buildings and other local history, I finally decided that I needed to share the information based on what my friends were telling me. The question was how to do that. In 2016, I decided the best way to do it was to offer free downtown Yakima guided walking history tours as a way to share that information with the general public. In 2016, I had one tour that was actually attended by about 90 people. It was really kind of an overloaded shock, and I was not prepared for that. And I was extremely surprised with how many people liked the history aspect. These are two photos that I took from 2018 of the downtown walking tours. I led the tours from 2016 to 2019, and then with the onset of COVID in 2020, I could not lead them. And with various things going on this year, I won't lead them again this year. I'm looking for other downtown areas. But in the meantime, I also still do lead the 2017, or starting in 2017, historic tours of Tahoma Cemetery. Tahoma Cemetery is the only historic cemetery within the city of Yakima. In 2017, after having inquiries about leaving elsewhere, I was able to work with the city of Yakima to begin leading tours at that cemetery. I switch the route every year on those tours. I will be having them this year. If you would like to attend those, you can sign up for reservation through the City of Yakima Parks Department. They are free. And for those of you who do not want to do a tour, and throughout COVID, I've been blessed to work with the City of Yakima in filming the tours. So you can go to their City of Yakima website, and there's 12 filmed clips out there of various sections. We paused for a while in the winter, but recently we have been refilming, so those will also be available online should you not want to take a walking tour, although they are a little different than the walking tours. After I started doing my tours the first year, I got approached by the History Press and Arcadia Publishing. That was in the spring of 17. I received a surprise email from them, and then multiple phone calls from their Pacific Northwest acquisitions editor. He was trying to convince me that I really needed to write a book about my tours. My initial response was probably the most unprofessional response anyone could give anybody. And that was, "I'm not sure you understand what I do. I talk about history, not write about it. I work in the civil engineering field, and that's about as far from writing it about history as one can be." Luckily, I found out that the acquisition editor had done his homework and had actually attended my tours and had been tracking me. He was a lot more confident than I was about my ability to put everything in words, and he was finally able to persuade me to do so, and that actually turned out to be a blessing. I finally agreed with them to write my first book, Hidden History of Yakima, and signed my contract. But then panic set in, and there was a lot of self-doubt and a lot of things going on. I thought I was crazy. I worked full-time. I was a mom. I now led 2 sets of historical tours, and occasionally I was able to sleep. I had 1 year from signing the contract to put everything in writing. That meant more research, picking the locations, getting permissions for photos, interviewing people, and somehow figuring out how to put it in words. But somehow I did manage to complete that, and I submitted my first form on time by my deadline, and it was released and appeared on the shelves of bookstores all over in October of 2018. 2 years later, in the spring of 2020, I spent most of my time when I wasn't working in isolation at home during COVID, much like the rest of the country. With all my tours canceled, I had no ways basically, to share the history of the valley that I had learned. Or was there a way? So one day, as I was bored sitting at home, I was looking through my computer, and I realized that I had, over the course of 2 years on and off, written an entire book on murder cases in Central Washington. And on a very skeptical whim, thinking that my publisher, there's no way they would ever take another book from me, I called them. The response was remarkably swift. Within 3 hours, there was a yes, I want it. And within a very short time afterwards, we signed our contract. 4 months later, the final documents were given to them, and Murder in Mayhem in Central Washington was released in February of this year. There's some commonalities between both of my books, although they're in various context forms and spread out. But there are some locations that are discussed in both books. And if you're local, I've had a lot of questions about the exact locations of those incidents. I could not put maps in my books because they required historical photos. So we'll go through a couple of those today in case anybody wants to go check out where they occurred. North Yakima City Hall and Schweitzer Opera House are two of the locations that are talked about in both of my books. In Hidden History of Yakima, they were both discussed as far as when they were built, their histories, that sort of thing. And in Murder and Mayhem in Central Washington, they were the key backgrounds for several scenes of trials, coroner inquisitions, holdings of people in jail, proceedings, that sort of thing. And both the North Yakima City Hall and Opera House were used to store the over 100 people that took place or were a part of the Coxy Army riots that occurred across the street. The North Yakima train depots are discussed in both books. The history of all four of Yakima's historic train depots are mentioned in Hidden History of Yakima. And the parking lot south of the present day Yakima train depot is the approximate location of where Coxey's Army riot occurred. If you look at the historic photo on the left, that is actually members of Coxey's Army who participated in that riot. They are sitting in what is approximately the parking lot area to the south of the depot and north of East Yakima Avenue. And that is the location where the riots eventually ensued. And then, of course, there's a block bordered by East Yakima Avenue, East Chestnut, South First Street, and South Second Street. It's also known as Chinatown in my first book, or part of Chinatown. In the 1890s, just before Yakima's Chinatown became fully established, the block located in that section was a rough and tumbling part of town. It was where literally people would sometimes live in tents if they were just traveling through to do business. You can tell in the photo to the left, which was taken in 1901. That would have been about 5 to 7 years after the murder of Tex Bagwell. Tex Bagwell's assassination is discussed in Murder and Mayhem, while Chinatown is discussed in Hidden History of Yakima. So this photo, the parking lot on the right, the modern one, is right behind Golden Wheel. So it's in between Golden Wheel and East Chestnut. That's the same location as the photo on the left that's historic, 120 or 30 years later. But that is the site where Tex was gunned down. A lot of times I'm asked how I discovered about all the stories that I placed in Murder and Mayhem, as well as all the history and Hidden History of Yakima. And my only answer to that is research, research again, and lastly, research again. It's countless. I still find information I didn't know on those sites after the publication of my books. But then again, neither of my books would have been possible without the access to research materials. If you're a history lover and an author, there are several places that are go-to for discovering research, especially if it's local. There's a tremendous amount of historical information at the Yakima Valley Library, the Yakima Museum. The Yakima Genealogical Library was also tremendously helpful. That is actually where I got the family backgrounds to help develop the characters of those in all the books, as well as living descendants to contact to get information from them about their family stories. The Ellensburg Library, Kittitas County Museum, and Roslyn Museum were also extremely helpful in finding resources and historic photos. Online places like the Washington State Digital Archives, the Washington State Historical Museum and Society, the National Archives, as well as various historic newspapers found online or at the museum, as well as places like Ancestry.com are invaluable if you're conducting research. But sometimes those online places cannot replace libraries and museums because not everything is digitized these days. And last but not least, I mean, if I didn't have a lot of the living descendants of the people I talk about in my books, it wouldn't be quite as interesting. I'm extremely thankful to some of those families for sharing their information and allowing me to share it in my books. And of course, a huge amount of gratitude goes out to the history lovers of Central Washington. Without them, my books probably wouldn't be there. And promoting them is also a huge deal. My editors and the staff at Arcadia Publishing and the History Press, between their confidence and assistance and endless communication with businesses and myself, my books would not have been as successful. They've been great. There's also other organizations and businesses that help promote the books, and that's the Yakima Library, of course, love them, the Yakima Valley Museum, Kittitas County Museum, and of course, local bookstores like Inklings and Encore. And in Ellensburg, Gerald's has been great, while Barnes and Noble and Kennewick has been great. And there's also countless online places that have been supportive selling my books. And that's about all I have for a PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully it didn't put anybody to sleep. Does anybody have any questions? Wow, I think I put everybody to sleep. Crystal, can you hear me?
I can. So someone typed into chat, the history of Yakima is so rich. Do you intend to write any more?
Yeah, I do have some projects that I am working on. I'm about 80 to 90% done with a book on several of the Civil War soldiers that came west after the Civil War. The Valley had over 200 of them, and their life stories once they got here are pretty interesting. I'm also working on a project about the numerous hospitals that Central Washington had in the early 1900s that people are unaware of. Everyone thinks we only had 2 or 3 hospitals. We actually had at one time over a dozen in the early 1900s in Yakima itself. And there's other projects I have on my list. Now that I'm retired, I can kind of spend more time in the archives now that they're open and get my research done, because that has to be done first.
So what for you has been, I'm sorry, I'm going to turn my camera back on. Let's do that. What for you has been the, I guess, hardest part about doing, was it like finding the time to do the research? Was it sort of, because I think if it were me, like I really enjoy history, and my assistant can tell you that I'm pretty much always telling her stories about just random history. But I think what would maybe have been frustrating for me would be to find maybe just a bit of a story, but not being able to find out, sort of the outcome. So I'm wondering what was difficult for you, if any, maybe not even about writing the book, but just about the research and just the work you've done.
Well, research is never easy, and it's time. I think with both books, because I was working full time, during the day, my amount of time that I could access archives was tight. It was really tight. And then also working full time, being a mom, Life stuff that happens. Timing was difficult. It's like I said, sometimes I slept. Now that I am retired and things are hopefully slowing down a little bit, my schedule is much more open. For example, today I spent a couple hours in the archives at the museum researching. I also spent a couple hours at the Genealogy library for a writers group, and researching, of course. So it's much more open for me now. I think right now my struggle is new to retirement, having to have a schedule because I have not had time to write. So
Mhm.
I decided that I'm Xing out a few days a week to research and write. It's a scheduling thing now because I'm wide open. But it is difficult. You can't go to all one source when you research things. You just have to keep digging and digging and digging. And then there's the character development that you have to have, because if you just write, or even on your tours, if you just say names and dates, it's going to bore everybody. You kind of, even in history writing, have to develop a little bit of character there so that it makes it more interesting. I mean, if you say Tom Jones was born in 1860 and died in 1910, it's not too interesting. So you have to actually, do some character research. Sometimes in my first book, like in History of Yakima, I was blessed to be able to find family members of the businesses in Chinatown and Japantown, and their recorded histories and their knowledge was a wealth of information that was beyond what I could have imagined, and really helped get their whole story in there versus just researching it.
Okay. So with your current book, your most recent book, a few of the stories kind of, I guess they weren't really cliffhangers, but it was definitely like a whodunit. Can you talk about maybe one or two of those? I'm really interested in what your theories are, because I'm sure there is probably some detail, or you probably even tried to sort of suss out the culprit in a few of those. So I want to hear your theories.
Okay, well, was there one of them in particular that you were interested in?
Oh, yeah, I honestly can't think of a specific one right now. There was one where the gentleman was murdered outside of his house and was just kind of like found out there a few hours later, but I can't remember specifically his
Oh, that
name.
was that in Yakima or Roslyn?
I think that was Roslyn.
Okay. Oh, that was the doctor that was assassinated.
Hmm.
That was not left as a cliff. None of my stories in Murder and Mayhem were left as cliffhangers. I know that's hard to believe. There's no sequel coming to that book, people. It's not a
Okay.
movie. There's not going to be a part two. They never found the killers of that doctor. Period. End of story. No one
Yeah.
was ever brought to trial.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that's what I mean about a cliffhanger, is that I just am wondering if you had any theories specifically, because I know there were kind of theories that were tossed around like as it was happening and after it was happening, but
Yeah, in that particular one in Roslyn, they found no one, arrested no one, charged no one.
mhm.
Another good one where it's kind of a cliffhanger that I've had a lot of questions about is the one of Tex Bagwell, which I covered in my presentation. They had multiple coroner inquests, multiple trials. They had multiple people arrested, placed in jail, called to trial, gone through testimony, and then all these people but one got freed. His supposed wife, filming, did actually hire the gentleman to kill Tex. She was not charged at all. She was held, and then they just dropped charges. The guy that she hired was not really charged that much either. He was a little bit, but the guy who actually did the killing got off because he was ill, so they just let him out of jail and never charged him. which is kind of ironic because in today's world, that would not be happening.
Right.
I still cannot figure out why they would let somebody else who paid somebody to kill someone off.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I get questions on the Schwano murders in Union Gap. He confessed to killing him point blank. He went home and he sent his son to get the cops and they arrested him. He went peacefully. He confessed to it. He absolutely said he was guilty. He was tried twice and was never officially charged. Although in that one, it's my belief from all my research that it was kind of based on at least temporary insanity. His health was deteriorating, his mental status. This man was wealthy. He was wealthy beyond belief. And when everything moved from Old Town, which was Union Gap, to Yakima, he lost everything.
Mm-hmm.
He would have been a millionaire in today's world. And when he died, he had like $900 left to his family's name. He lost everything. So I think the two trials, and they wouldn't come out and say it in the recordings I had, that he was kind of just excused based on health and temporary insanity.
Mm-hmm.
Because no one in this world today who confessed to murdering somebody would be tried twice and found innocent.
Right. Yeah.
Does that help answer your question?
It does. It does. So do you, we are getting some questions that are popping up in here. Let's look at this. Looks like, how big was is it Coxy?
Yes.
The Coxy Army, how big was that riot?
Big. It was so big that when Coxy's army, it really wasn't an army, it was unemployed white men, pretty much mad because they didn't have jobs because the railroad was hiring Asians to do that. Although when they were offered jobs, they wouldn't take them. So who knows? It was big. In Yakima, there were 120 people arrested for that riot. There were over 200 people involved. And imagine Yakima 130 years ago, 800 people showed up to watch the riot. You couldn't get 800 people to show up to watch anything in Yakima today. And imagine not having cars. It was so big, like I said, they jailed over 120 people, tried 100 people. And it also stopped, basically, for the most part, their whole rebellion. The whole intent of them was to get over to the East Coast, to DC, to protest what was going on as a quasi-union, because unions hadn't started. When they did that in Yakima, every town on the West Coast stood up, saw what happened, and said, it's not happening in my town. So they would not let many Coxy Army participants get off the trains and spend any time in their city. So West Coast, it just basically wiped out most of their demonstration.
Gracious.
Good old Yakima.
Yeah. Okay, another question. Can you give any budding writers tips on how you got your leads and or verified your historical sources?
Leads as far as research or leads as far as a publisher or?
Good question. I would assume leads in terms of research. Oh, she says research. Leads in terms of research. So kind of like where you came up with or where you happened upon the stories. Was it just reading old newspapers and?
So yes, I get a lot of information from old newspapers. When it comes to the buildings themselves in Chinatown and Japantown, there were several articles in old newspapers throughout the Northwest. The problem with old newspapers is it's contextual, right? There's a lot of verbiage I refuse to use in 100-year-old newspapers. There was a lot of racism in 100-year-old newspapers towards the Asians in my research. And not every sometimes they still kind of had an AP back then. So if a story was run here, it'd be picked up by Spokane.
Mhm.
Oftentimes names are misspelled, but it's a start to look through old newspapers. It's a very good start because you can definitely also get a tone for what's going on. But you can't just use the names as they spell them or the information or the dates because they're often wrong. But you can get the concept and then go research the dates or research the events and find out more. So that's sometimes where I started to pick up my
Mhm.
stories. My bibliography in the back shows a lot of newspaper articles that I got information from, and I didn't list all of my references because my concept was if someone wants to go look real quick, they're going to go look at those newspaper articles that I cited in the back of the book, and they can get a general tone for it. But you need to take that information, then you need to go look at a whole heck of a lot of books. Archives everywhere. Oftentimes they have information, maybe not on the event, but the people involved on the event. And that's a lot of stuff you cannot find online.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question?
Yep. She says yes. She says that does answer, and I will add into that yeah, but in the early days of my library career, I was doing a bunch of our obituary research. We'd have people from all over the US, sometimes overseas, emailing and asking about, just kind of to find like this person died in Yakima, North Yakima, or whenever, turn of the century prior to that. And so you'd get into the microfilm and start looking. And I have to admit, constantly was distracted by just these little stories and these blurbs about
You do.
just the most random things that wouldn't even be on anyone's radar these days. Just, there was, I think, a story about someone who built like this lovely modern house, and it was just he built a house, and it was a whole newspaper article, and
Yeah.
they listed the rooms and
Okay.
the type of
The contractor, the cost.
countertops, and yeah,
Yeah.
all of that. So it's fascinating, and so I will second that. Just kind of sifting through microfilm and that sort of thing is a really good place to find those stories and just to kind of get a feel for those historical eras. Okay,
Thank you for that,
so
Crystal.
we've got another question. So, how did you develop an interest in historical concerns? Also, which of the stories in Murder and Mayhem did you personally find the most compelling and interesting? Oh, did we lose her? Oh no. Let me see. There you go. All right, we just need you to unmute. You're back.
Okay. Don't know what happened. Sorry.
Okay. All right, we are good. So did you hear that whole question? Did you need me to reread that?
I didn't hear any of the question. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So how did you develop an interest in historical concerns? And also, which of the stories in Murder and Mayhem did you personally find the most compelling and interesting?
Wow. How did I develop an interest? So here's a little confession. Don't tell anybody, even though you're recording this and it will be out in the world soon. When I was a child growing up all through school, I hated history. It was the worst. And it was the way that it was taught. And it's not any teacher's fault. I had great teachers, but it's the curriculum often that they have to follow. And I think a lot of people can relate to this. How many of us remember being in history class and all we did was memorize names, dates, and places, right?
Mhm.
Does any? So I hated it. It was boring until I got older, moved back to Yakima, and decided that these old buildings we had really probably had a story. And when I was able to discover some of those stories, Well, then you have names and events that happen at those, and all of a sudden it's way more interesting, if that makes any sense. If you put events and names and people in a building and talk about what happened there, it's more captivating to the general public than if you just said this building was built in 1908 by Anne Joe Q. Public. So once I figured out that I could add characters and add events to places, it became a lot more fascinating. And hopefully, other people feel the same. As far as what story was the most captivating to me, they were all pretty interesting, and it was very difficult. When you write history, you have to leave your personal opinions out as best you can. I mean, it always comes out in your style, but you can't put in there that, was ridiculous. They didn't charge anybody for a crime.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found was captivating and probably the hardest one to write without me interjecting personal thoughts might have been the Perkins murder, if anybody recalls that one. That was the one where the woman and her husband were buried alive, and she is buried in the Atanam graveyard. I think that one was the most perplexing for me because as I was researching the family to get the characters on that, there's this whole wide world that nobody wanted to talk about. When the Perkins were murdered, it hit newspapers all over the country. And it was portrayed as these ravishing Native Americans that were just killing people left and right. Okay, there were skirmishes between white settlers and Indians. No one's disputing that. But what no one was willing to talk about was the family's really long history with skirmishes with Indians. If you recall from that chapter, her grandfather was the first white person killed in the Pacific Northwest Indian Wars, Mr. McAllister, several years before that. He was killed during a battle, legitimately, but his son and his son-in-law went outside of the legal realms, walked into the courthouse, and shot these people before their trial point blank with not one charge placed on them. An eye for an eye is not legal. It's not right. It's not moral. He was never charged. That was Ms. Perkins' father who did that. Ultimately, her father and mother separated, and her father went down to Arizona and was mining when Geronimo's tribe was struggling with little battles. And ironically, he was killed in one of those battles. This is becoming, when you read a family in 3 different places, having personal battles with 3 different tribes, there's something there that says are they provoking this? Because the average pioneer was not just followed all over Western United States by different Indian tribes and hunted down, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little give and take, particularly when Miss Perkins' brother drugged one of the Indians back and is thought to have murdered him, but there's no proof and there's no trial, and he's never charged. There's a little karmic action in that whole entire family for 3 generations. I think I found that to be one of the hardest chapters to write, just based on the fact that the morals and the double standards of charging people and then making it out to be all of the Native Americans' fault. It was hard to keep personal opinions out of that because the whole setup was just ridiculous, if that makes sense.
I think that answered his question.
I hope so.
Okay, let's see. Okay, we have another question. My great great-grandfather sent his family to Yakima in the 1860s
Uh-oh,
and
cutting
said
out.
he would meet them. Oh, am I?
Oh no, can
Am I
anybody
cutting
hear
out?
me?
Can I hear? Oh no, I think we lost you again.
I am so sorry. I
Oh,
don't,
it's
of
okay.
course, there was one question you were reading. I'm sorry, I cut
hmm
out.
This one, where did it go? Okay, so this was someone who asked about my great-great-grandfather sent his family to Yakima in the 1860s and said he would meet them after the war. Where do you do your research to get those names?
Oh, to get the names of the family members?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, so of course, the library has information on families in their archives and on their shelves. But if you're trying to get names and do the genealogy, I would really suggest going to the Yakima Valley Genealogy Library. If you don't know the names, they can help you trace them back on their computers. That's what that particular library does, is family research. They also have other history books there. Yakima Valley Libraries can help you with that too. I know that you guys have had ancestry stuff online and are pretty good about helping with that too. But I'm not sure what the Yakima Valley Library's priority is when it comes to that versus just tracing someone's family tree. I know at the genealogy library, they have the programs that can do it for you as well as the books and all the obits and that stuff as well. So
Mhm.
there's two sources you could go there. Um, they are a wealth of information as well. Either would probably work, although Crystal, I don't know how much time you guys can prioritize towards just tracking down someone's history for them if they don't know the names. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
So we actually have, we have several librarians here at the Central Library. And we have a book a librarian service, which I don't think we have opened up yet since we're still kind of under restrictions with social distancing. And our Northwest Reading Room will be opening, I hope, in the next few months here. And our archives librarian, Terry Walker, is a insanely knowledgeable resource
Yes.
about pretty much any historical or research topic you can think about that is
Right.
regional.
Terry's great. And I know
Yeah.
she's led online and
hmm
ancestry.com stuff that people can go to.
Yes.
But and again, Terry's busy. She's trying to get that room set up, I know.
hmm
I would suggest actually trying your library and then actually going as well down to the genealogy. They have shelves of every single state in this nation down there
Yeah.
that you can train it. But so does your archives reading room. I got a sneak preview of that. Don't tell anybody. Did I say that? I'll be down there all the time, Crystal, and you guys are gonna have to kick me out when that thing opens up. You got a couch? But yeah, I think both places are a good place to start. I mean,
Mhm.
both can help.
Yeah, and I will say for those of you who are local to the Valley, who have library cards, or if you're eligible to get a Yakima Valley Libraries card, we do have Ancestry available. I believe it's still available for home use because of the social distancing restrictions that have been going on. So if you have any questions about that, you should maybe reach out to your nearest community library, and staff can help you find that on the website and get set up to access it. All right.
Did I
Okay,
miss
looks
any others or did I bore
so we
everybody?
have one more question, and then I think we are good to wrap up. So this one is, do people ever approach you with stories they think you would be interested in researching? Like, are people pitching you tales on the street corners?
Ha! Pitching me tales. Okay, so when I lead tours, one thing I do like about tours is people volunteer information to me nonstop. Like the downtown tours, they'll say, "Oh, my aunt used to work in that restaurant," and the story she has, and I always say, "Can I tell that story in public? Because if I can't, don't tell me anymore." because that's just the way I wrote. This is about sharing. And the same with the cemetery. Oh, that's my uncle. He did this, that, and other thing. So I always kind of tell people, you know, are you telling me this privately, or are you telling me to share it? As far as books, that's a different story. I get this random array of, I've gotten everything from, hey, we should write a book together. Now, there's a few people that have said that to me that I absolutely would consider writing a book together with, because I know them. I know how they operate on factual stuff, trust them completely. But when a random stranger walks up to me and say, I think we should write a book, you start to wonder, really? Because I don't think you understand how that all works. And then, of course, there's stories. I hear a lot of wonderful stories that I would love to put in writing and share. Unfortunately, you know, it has to be of, how do I say it, book quality. If your story is only going to be 2 pages long, we can't write a book on it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm always looking for stories, and I especially love it when it's family stories or somebody they know, because it's much more personal, and then you can do the research on the other stuff. But yeah, there's that random, or the random email. I mean, I've gotten emails from New York telling me I should write about this, that, or the other thing from people I don't even know. So I do have a list of ideas. If somebody has an idea, email me. I would love to look at it and consider it. Does that answer your question?
I believe I did answer their
Perfect.
question. Okay, and I think I've gotten to everyone's questions. If anyone has any more questions, go ahead and type them into chat. If not, I think we are going to bid Ellen a grateful farewell. Okay.
Hey, it's been great. Thanks for including me on your series. It's been a real honor. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. We have had a ton of interest in your book even before we actually had it available in the collection to check out. There was already a wait list for it. So
Oh, yay. That's
yeah,
always a good
yeah.
sign.
So people have been really interested in it.
Good.
All right. So thank everyone for joining us
Yes, thanks
tonight.
everyone.
Thank you. You will get a survey in your email that just kind of is us gathering information about tonight's presentation, any kind of suggestions you have for new topics or upcoming events. And I will say, just keep an eye on our website and our column in Scene on Thursdays in the Herald for upcoming events and activities and just library happenings. And again, thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a good night.
Bye, everybody. Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night.